I was waiting for anyone, but I got one last thing. I was waiting. A lot of the time, the leadership is going to take action and do what they do. And a lot of the time, the normal people aren't going to recognize what they're doing or appreciate what they're doing. A lot of time, the leadership just kind of gets overlooked, and you see that with Jesus when it says that he had compassion over these people and he went to go take action on them. What did they focus on? They focused on the food. They're only focused on the food. It wasn't that the man had compassion over them. Same thing goes for us today, that if you take action, a lot of people aren't going to see it. You're going to take that leadership role. Not a lot of people are going to see it. And unless they step up and become that, put themselves in the leadership role, they're not going to have the appreciation or the understanding of what the leadership actually takes to run it. So with all of that, the leadership still has to go. But in taking that role, it's an understanding of, I'm going to do the things, but no one's going to see it but God.
Mm-hmm. You don't need to. With trying to make sure that you're being led the right way, how much do you need to be informed with the leaders and the decisions they're making, as far as like if they're having a men's business meeting, how much do you need to know about what's going on?
That'll be the next point, so I'm going to build off of Reese's point. So everybody hear that? Probably not. Say it again.
How much do you need to know with the decisions the men are making in the congregation, as far as what they talk about in the men's meeting or what decisions they're making?
Okay. How much do you need to know? All of it. All of it.
Well, I think that there's, in regard to what Rachel said, there's two examples that I can think of, Sandpoint and Mount Zion, where things were being hidden from the people that they had a right to know. I mean, just the decisions that were made. Well, we're going to hide. I don't think they said hide, but we're going to keep this. We're not going to talk to the congregation about this.
Yeah.
Why not?
Recorded live. Studio audience. Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's very good to see you. And it's very good to have our visitors with us today. Thanks for coming and stopping by, seeing us while you're out here on your trip. So we're wanting to start this morning with a question that actually came up from last week, and it got recorded on the microphone, so that recording will be before this class, but my response to it was not recorded because we'd already shut everything down, and I wasn't joking. We had already stopped, so we're going to take more questions. And that gave me some time to think about it and come up with a politically correct answer.
A politician answer. Perhaps.
No, I plan on giving the same answer as I remember it being given last Sunday.
No.
So we're going through John chapter 10, and we were establishing in John 10 with Jesus setting a contrast between what the nation of Israel was suffering through with their leadership at that time, and how that Jesus was establishing himself as a greater and better leader than what they had. Now, of course, that's not anything new if these individuals were actually reading and studying their scriptures, their Old Testament scriptures, correctly. Because even Moses was preparing the nation of Israel that there was going to be a prophet that was going to be like him, but in fact was going to be greater than he was, and that they were supposed to listen to him and obey his voice. So as we're going through all that discussion about leadership and making sure that the leaders were behaving properly, that they are upholding their office honorably and justly, and that they are leading correctly the sheep in the way in which they're supposed to go. Reese made a comment that'll be on recording before this class gets uploaded also.
Better be. No.
But then a question came in about, well, how much information does the congregation need when decisions are being made? And for example, if elders are having meetings, or since the congregation here, we do not have elders, so the men come together and meet, deliberate, and make decisions. How much does the congregation need to know so as to make sure that they're not being led in the wrong direction? And my response was that as long as what we're discussing is not anything of a confidential matter, now I didn't mention that last time, but I'm adding that now, because sometimes we may be dealing with situations that are like that. As long as it's not a confidential matter, then everybody within the congregation has every right to know about what is being discussed and what decisions are going to potentially be made. Yes?
What makes it a confidential matter?
If it's just a private matter, like something that's just come up being confessed inside of the meeting and needs to be given time to be addressed and be dealt with, then it'd be a similar situation of like a Matthew 18. That, okay, here's something that's happened. Very likely it's being brought up in the men's meeting for advice, counsel. Then, okay, we'll discuss that, deliberate on that. You go handle it, and nothing's going to be said. Because the whole point of a Matthew 18 private matter is to keep the entire thing private, to where something can happen, be resolved without anybody else being the wiser. So that would be a situation like that. But as far as anything else, with decisions that are being made here, yeah, everybody should be informed, and everybody should be, granted opportunity to have input. And so I understand from one standpoint on how some individuals don't like that, because you're trying to get something done, and then you start getting too many brains and too many mouths on the situation, that can end up slowing things down to where there's too much deliberation, and then it's just, well, we're trying to get this done, and everybody keeps having an input, so on and so forth. A lot of people just try to bypass that, and it's just, well, we're just going to make the decisions. I can understand that frustration, but that doesn't mean that you actually need to go about and do that. Because if you're going to be making a decision on behalf of other people, and then you're going to expect them to follow through with what the decision is, they need to know about it. So it's be similar to the things that go on with the tent meeting and what we're talking about that we're going to do and all these kind of things. Okay, you should have a voice in that and input in that, because you're going to be a worker in that. And that, okay, if you're expecting me to do this, then I ought to have some say as to what's being done. And then, especially considering that there might be a better idea out there than what is presently had at the moment. And so we did discuss last week, or was brought up, how that we've actually run into problems of that very nature, of different ones being holders of information, gatekeepers of information. Was brought up about the Sandpoint congregation in Idaho, and how we just tried to discuss with them about their fellowship problems, and they wanted to have it all go to Daryl, the preacher, and it's just like, no, we're not going to do that, because he's not the head honcho. He's not the only one that's supposed to be making decisions. All of the men need to be aware of the information, the accusations that are being made, so that everybody's informed, everybody can make a decision. And then it was also brought up with Mount Zion in Tennessee, and how it was that they weren't coming forth and sharing actual, factual information of false accusations they're making against the work here, and how they even admitted that, yeah, they really didn't do their due diligence, investigate properly into the things that were happening here, but it stays within their evangelism committee. They're the only ones that knows about the conversations that went on, and how that all of that is stemming from a manipulation and a false concept of 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy chapter 2, on how it is that, well, women are supposed to keep silent. No, not in every single matter, and especially when it comes to things that we're discussing as a congregation that we're wanting the congregation to do. They're just as much the congregation as the men are. And their voice, their thoughts, are not in any way inferior to what the men would have to say. So in a lot of ways, it is a very similar situation of what we have here with the Pharisees, in that they make claims. So the claim would be, so this is something we get bombarded with a whole lot within the Church of Christ, and that we supposedly don't respect our women. And that you would even have individuals like the Mount Zion congregation. Oh, no. We respect and we honor our women, this, that, and the other. Well, okay, how do you treat them when it comes time for them to speak up and actually say something? Yeah. You start trying to push them around, bully them down, and talk over them using, use your authoritative voice so as to beat them into submission. So you will say certain things to try to ward off accusation, but then when it actually comes time for you to back that up and to honor that, you don't do it. You, in fact, behave the very way these Pharisees are behaving. You incite fear and what else? Go along with that. Fear and guilt. Let's put that. What?
Intimidation.
Intimidation, fear, and guilt. So as to get your way. That's exactly what the Pharisees are doing. And so another thing I thought about later on with the Mount Zion point, and how it was that they started trying to make accusation against us because when we called Joe and we called Gilbert, we had the ladies involved in that call. Why not? Are they not witnesses? Are we not supposed to bring forth witnesses so as to lay out a thing to make sure that it's founded and that it's truthful? But in their mind says, well, as long as it's, obviously it'd have to be as long as it's men that are witnesses, that they'd actually be able to come forth and be able to speak.
We even brought two, so that it equals.
Oh yeah, yeah, 2 women equals out to 1 man. So yeah, it is a very crazy situation that we have going on throughout our brotherhood, to where the things that we have Jesus discussing here about the Pharisees, and we've been discussing this throughout our Matthew class and throughout our John study, these attitudes and these characteristics are very much alive and well today. And that you have people falling in line in congregations simply because, well, I don't want to have the elders, I don't want to have the men come down on me. And that's the same fear that these people had in Jesus' day. Well, we don't want to confess Jesus because they'll kick us out of the synagogue. They'll disown us and cast us out. Well, that may be. And that may just be what you have to end up enduring so as to be faithful. But it's still a difficult thing. But we have the blind man, and he was able to withstand it. So I just wanted to bring that back up so that what I said this time could actually make it on the recording, as it didn't make it last time. So any other thoughts, comments on that point before we move on to John?
I think it's really important for the women to hear this and to apply it to the congregation.
Say it louder.
I think it's very important for the women to hear this and apply it to the congregation. Like, as we're going through these studies, it's not just, oh, Micah has good words, nod your head, I agree, but when it comes time to have ideas or to speak or to do anything in front of the congregation, not to shut down and go, oh, yeah, you guys just pick everything, you guys do everything. Because it's everyone involved, and it's very important for everyone to put their feet in.
And it's not only here in the congregation, but even with matters at home. To have women feel comfortable into a position of, well, okay, I can question something, and not only be in an area of questioning something, but even calling something out as being incorrect, and not have to worry about being outside of submission. Because that's not what that word means. Submission doesn't mean you just lay down, roll over, and put up with every little thing that goes on. If the husband is not behaving as a husband should, who should be the first one to say that to the husband?
His help.
His helpmeet. That's what she's there for. But you have a lot of people. It's funny, man. I cannot even remember how this conversation got brought up. But when I was training to drive a school bus, and the other school bus driver, Erica, she was taking me out. I don't know, somehow we got on that topic, and she brought up about what's my view of Ephesians 5 and how the woman's supposed to be in submission to the husband. And it's just like, and I started out, well, there's a lot of misunderstanding and there's a lot of abuse that goes on with that passage. And she kind of started talking about some stuff. I don't know if it personally happened to her, if it was just things that she experienced. But of course, she's not a member of the church. She's coming from a denominational background. But that's just, it's taking place all over. And so a lot of what it does, so a lot of what it boils down to is just a misunderstanding of this leadership role. Yes, somebody is in charge, but that doesn't just make you the head honcho. This is a joint leadership that's happening. Husband and wife are supposed to be working together. So then within the church, within the congregation, eldership and the brethren are supposed to be working together. Now, I understand there are a lot of brethren, they're more than happy to just let the elders make all the decisions and just leave me out of it. I'm too busy, I'm not interested, this, that, and the other. That's not good either. Yes?
To add on top of that, for the leader of the household, he's still in submission to someone greater than him.
Yeah.
So it's going back to Matthew, you're going to be judged for what you do. So if you're just, you submit to me, all authority is given to me, you bow at the knee pretty much, same thing's going to happen to you with the next person in line. Okay, you're treating them like that, I'm going to treat you like that. So you got to keep in mind, it's not you where it ends, it's the next one up.
Mm-hmm. And even as we see with Jesus in his leadership, how does Jesus handle questions? How does he handle questioning from the people that are quote unquote underneath him?
He explains things to them.
He's not afraid of being questioned. He doesn't see that as a stab or jab at his authority. He allows the questions and he answers the questions. That's what a leader does. That's just what heroes do. But on the other hand, if you have somebody who's just a manager and really is not a good leader, a manager takes the mindset of, no, I'm in charge, you do what I say. And nobody really likes a manager. But everybody appreciates a leader. So that's a big difference. And that's what, again, another point that Jesus is trying to set a contrast between what they have with the Pharisees now, what they could have with him. Right now, you've got a bunch of managers that don't care about you, and they're not following the rules. But if you'll follow me, I'm going to be a leader. And the picture's in the standpoint of the shepherd. So any other comments or questions on that? All right, so John 10. We're going to pick it up in verse 3. But one of the things that I'm wanting to do before we pick up in verse 3 is I'm wanting to help put within our brains a visualization of what Jesus is dealing with at this time. Now, the reason for that is because, as we've mentioned a few times in our classes, we have the tendency of going to certain chapters and certain sections, and we start viewing that chapter as being, well, this is an answer to this denominational point. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing with the scriptures. Now, is it the case that that is in here? Does John chapter 10 answer some denominational doctrines?
Yes.
Yes. When we're thinking about from the standpoint, teaching people about the one true church, and that contrasted to man-made churches, the denominations that we have around us, yes, this passage helps with that. But that's not what this passage is about. What you have being presented is a picture that Old Testament Israel had, or should have had, all throughout their existence. And that is this picture of the fold. Throughout the Old Testament, you have the nation of Israel as God's people, and they are in this realm of protection. In Isaiah chapter 5, verse 5, Isaiah writes to Israel at that time, trying to remind them of the kind of nation they were supposed to be. In verse 5, God gives Isaiah a message and says, "And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard." So we have the contrast between sheepfold, sheep, and vineyard, but the imagery is still the same. The first thing that is done to this vineyard is, I will take away the hedge thereof. God had put around the nation a wall of protection, a wall of division that had separated them from the world and its dangers, and had secluded them and put them in a place of protection. And at this time, God is saying, well, I'm going to take that away because you're not producing the kind of fruit that I'm wanting you to produce. And at this time that you have Jesus laying out this illustration, it is still that same picture as to who he's talking about. Because when it came to the giving forth of the gospel, who was to get it first?
Jews.
The Jews, Israel. That's why you have Matthew chapter 10. He doesn't send out the apostles to the Gentiles. He says you go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Paul in the Romans letter establishes, yes, you were the ones to receive this first, and you rejected it. So here is the audience. Here's the imagery that Jesus is laying out with the shepherd, the sheep, the fold. It's dealing with Israel. And here's what God has given to you. But Israel had allowed the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and other groups to come along and to usurp the authority, or usurp authority that had not been given to them, and they had become a dominating power inside of Israel. So you have your thieves and your robbers that have climbed in to the nation and are now leading it astray, forcing upon them their own traditions and their own commandments and their own doctrines that they've come about to establish. Now that's important because as we get down to verse 16, hopefully today, that's going to become a key factor into understanding all of this imagery. And even as we're, where we left off last week in verse 3, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name and leadeth them out. So for homework, you're supposed to do some research on the porter and who he is. What'd you find?
Is it the Holy Spirit?
No.
Okay.
Huh? All right. So that's the definition of the word, is an under shepherd, or a shepherd who is underneath that head shepherd. But that still doesn't answer who it is.
He's the helper of Jesus.
Okay.
So the flock doesn't answer to they don't answer to his voice.
Okay.
They answer to Jesus' voice.
Okay.
He just manages and takes care of them for the shepherd.
Okay.
So that'd be Christians?
No.
So
The apostles?
Nope.
it's the Jews trying, well, the leaders
Mhm.
of the Jews, they should have been in that role at this point.
Okay.
But they weren't. They were the thieves and the robbers.
Okay. So that's definitely, some of that's in there, but you're still missing the person. What'd you say, Rebecca? Huh? No. Who is it, Christina? I don't know. Huh? What? What'd you say? It's John the Baptist.
You say novice?
No.
Oh,
That was my
I thought you said novice. Turned away.
So when you look at what the porter is doing, now, what everybody said is correct. Elders are supposed to be like this. The Jewish leaders, the priest, high priest, they all fall into this category, and they're all supposed to be falling into this work. But when we have this in the context of Jesus speaking of himself, and of him being the good shepherd, and then we have this individual, the porter, this person who's coming before him and opening the door for him, preparing the way for him. It all points back to John. So when we consider passages like Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3, prophetic of who John, the role that John was going to play, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. So here is all of this preparation being made for the shepherd to come in. And even as you go back to John chapter 1, you remember the Pharisees send a group of individuals to question John. And this is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" And this is a good point to make here that we didn't make back then. We are seeing very clearly in chapter 1 the hierarchy that's been established. But it's not the way that God intended it. The priests and the Levites are the ones that God said in the Old Testament, okay, you guide Israel. You watch over Israel. But in this situation, who sent the Levites and the priests? Who's on top? Who's in charge? That they are answering to? It's the Pharisees. So the very ones that God put in charge have found themselves underneath another group that they're answering to. So that's just a point to make now that we didn't make back then. So the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." They asked him, "What then? Art thou Elias?" He saith, "I am not." "Art thou that prophet?" He answered, "No." Then said they unto him, "Who art thou, that we may give an answer to them that sent us? What sayest thou of thyself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah." Here is John the immerser, the porter, to introduce the shepherd to Israel. Okay, the sheep have been waiting for the shepherd to come. All right, we're going to get you ready. We're going to send this other shepherd out. He's going to prepare it. And when the shepherd arrives, he's going to open the door. And when Jesus came on the scene, John chapter 2, John saw Jesus coming, and what did he say?
Behold. I can't think of it.
Behold, the Lamb of God. He ends up saying it twice. The next day, Jesus came again. And there's John, pointing people, directing people to the shepherd. And we see the very thing happen that Jesus is talking about in this parable happening. When John makes that confession, what happens with his own disciples?
Turn away. Turn towards.
I'm trying to think who the first two were. Was it Peter and Andrew? Okay. John makes that confession, behold the Lamb of God. Okay, Peter and Andrew, they go off and follow him. Yeah, it was Andrew first, and then Peter comes along later. And then in Matthew chapter 10, you have Jesus calling his apostles, calls them by name. He sees Matthew sitting at the table of collection, table of taxation. He says, Matthew, come and follow me. All of this is playing out right before their very eyes. So as we just mentioned, John 10:3, the sheep hear his voice, calleth his own sheep by name, leadeth them out. When he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. So Jesus has begun to call his sheep out of this Old Testament system. Here we have Israel, true Israel, that will hear and that will believe his voice. As we mentioned, Israel gets the call first. But of course, as we have noticed in our time together in our studies, Israel is not the only one that's answering the call at this time. All throughout Jesus' work and his teaching and his preaching, you have Samaritans that are showing up, and you have Gentiles that are showing up also. And they're following the shepherd. And thus we have the implementation or the desire that he's putting forth so as to lead all men into that faith of Abraham. So throughout our John study, we have the Jews, and they're constantly, well, we're of Moses. And then once that doesn't work, they go even further back in their history. Well, we're children of Abraham. Well, you don't live like him. You don't follow the same kind of teachings that Abraham followed. So here we are in John 10, but we're also dealing with the same subject matter, again, from John 1, 11 and 12. He came unto his own. That's Israel. And his own received him not. Here he is coming to the sheep of his father. The ones that should have been ready to receive his voice, but they would not listen. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. So you have this contrast between the true Israel, the true Jews that will follow by faith, but then you have that section of Israel that's being led by the Pharisees. And they will not hear. They will not understand. And the Pharisees are even going so far as to close people off from even following him. And we'll notice a passage from Luke a little bit later on that further establishes that. So verse 16, we're jumping ahead just so we're making sure we've got the picture clear in our minds as to what we're dealing with here. Other sheep I have which are not of this fold. That's referencing the fold of Israel. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Jesus is beginning to call individuals out of Israel, the remnant that the Old Testament prophets talked about, and even Gentiles, to be brought together into one fold. So even here, Jesus is destroying the premillennialist idea that says, well, when Jesus comes back, the whole nation is going to be saved and is going to be converted. And the whole nation of Israel is going to follow Christ. That's not what he's teaching here. This is not a nationalistic situation. This is an individual situation. There are going to be some sheep that will not listen. And so they're not going to be inside of the fold, and they're going to be lost. And this fold, or the flock, that's mentioned at the end of verse 16, is going to become the church. So you have those outside of the denominational world, in particular Andrew Sluter and his crowd, the dispensational crowd, that they have a real problem with us teaching that, well, there's this shift from Israel, that God rejects Israel, and now his focus and his care is being placed on the church. I don't know of any other way to understand it. That's exactly the picture that's being presented here. You have this fold, which is Israel, but I'm calling people out of that fold so they can then be put over here. And because of this, verse 19 is going to inform us of another division that's being made. Well, what kind of division is it that's being made? The ones in the flock of God and the ones that are out of the flock of God. In Acts chapter 20, in verse 28, when Paul is speaking to the elders at Ephesus, he mentions of them how they are to shepherd, feed, watch over the flock of God. And he's talking about the church. Galatians chapter 6, in verse 16, Paul is writing to this church at Galatia, and he's writing to Christians, and notice how he describes them at the conclusion or the salutation of his letter. And as many as walk according to this rule. Well, what rule is this? It's the Christian rule. Peace be on them, and mercy, and upon the Israel of God. That's why Paul would write in Colossians chapter 2 to that church on how it is that we are now the circumcision of God. That we've been circumcised with a circumcision that's made without hands, and that being of the heart. But all throughout Israel's history, as you're reading through the Old Testament, you're constantly seeing this shift taking place from Moses, the law, into this branch of Jesse, to this lineage of the King David. And then how he's going to become a ruler over Israel. But not just a ruler, he's going to become priest as well. So all of this, before we start taking this out and we start viewing it denominationally, we first need to keep it as it's being spoken by Jesus. He is talking to this Jewish audience, and he is showing to them here there is a shift that's coming from the nation of Israel to this new fold, this new flock that's going to be placed over here. And you can either come out of this and come into here, or you can stay over here. But if you stay over here, you're not going to get these blessings that are over here. Then verse 5, he points out again, a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. Once again, reference to the Pharisees. Pharisees, Sadducees, and even for that matter, the Levites and the priests. Because we've already established they're no longer following the authority of God. The Pharisees are in authority. And they're actually bossing the Levites and the priests around. And the Pharisees, we've been watching them. They've been trying to do everything that they can to discredit Jesus. To get people to stop listening to him. But what we're finding is that there is a group that will not be deterred. And we just had an example of that in John chapter 9 with the blind man. Here they are trying to do everything they can so as to get him to not follow Jesus, so as to follow them. But there's a group inside of Israel that's listening to the shepherd, and they will not be abused, they will not be browbeaten or intimidated so as to reject Jesus. Oh, sorry. But then also in verse 5, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. So here's the group of Matthew 7, where Jesus is going to say unto them, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I know you not. What you're saying doesn't sound right. What you're saying does not make sense. It doesn't mesh. It's not lining up. And especially considering what you say doesn't line up with how you're supposed to live. With these false shepherds, they are experiencing everything that we just listed. The abuse, the intimidation, the fear. And if you remember, we went back into Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and we read how those Old Testament prophets brought words of condemnation to the pastors, to the shepherds of Israel at that time. And what were they doing? They weren't upholding their work. They were not protecting the sheep. They were not healing the sheep of their diseases and their sicknesses. They were devouring the sheep. And now here we are once again. And the sad thing is that for a lot of people inside of this system, they know that something's wrong. But they're just waiting for somebody to come along and help them out of it. And to a large degree, with a lot of our brethren today, they are in congregations and they know something's wrong. And very likely they're just waiting for a shepherd, a leader, to actually step in and start doing something. But the sad thing is that they're waiting on a leader that very likely is them. And that they just need to step up and take action. Okay, you know something's needing to change? Do something about it. But even with this imagery, the people still are not getting it. So John 6, this parable, spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. Then said Jesus unto them again, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. So not only the shepherd, but as we mentioned in our sermon, he's also the door. And so from this Jewish system to his new covenant, Jesus is ushering people in to his church that's going to be established on Pentecost. All of this is a transition time frame to where, yes, we're still under the law of Moses, but you need to recognize this is fading away. That this is going to be done with. So either you're going to follow me over into this new system, or you're going to be trapped here under this old system. And again in this section we have the terms thieves and robbers being used. So he doesn't change that terminology. We mentioned the Pharisees, Sadducees, a few other groups. They were already in existence before Jesus came on the scene. And in fact, they had been around for a few hundred years before Jesus started his work. And that they had grown out of the Old Testament by stepping in and adding their own traditions and their own laws. And here Jesus is pointing out to this crowd, it's like, okay, you should have recognized what was happening, and you shouldn't have allowed it to happen. You know this doesn't sound right. You know this doesn't make any sense. But you just let it come in and take over. Now, granted, you go back and you do some research into the history of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, not so much the Sadducees, but with the Pharisees, they got started out of good motives. It's during the time of the Maccabees. Greece is coming in, and Alexander the Great and everything that he was doing to conquer the world at that time, and Alexander the Great was not a nice person. And he was trying to incorporate a lot of Greek mythology, Hellenistic views into Jewish law, into Jewish religion. And you had a group that stood up, fought back, and said, no, we're not going to do that. And that's where the Pharisees came about. It grew out of that time of turmoil and persecution and outside influence, and they were just saying, nope, we're not going to do that. But it's like they say about absolute power. It corrupts, absolutely. And that Jesus is pointing out, even with good motives, shouldn't have listened to them. Where they started going beyond what the Scripture actually says and what God actually teaches, that's where your following should have stopped. And so even with this passage, we do not have Jesus in the mentality of, oh, well, you know, let's just go along to get along. The Pharisees are just over there, we're going to be over here, and everybody's fine. He doesn't use that kind of terminology. Well, they have some truth, and they're just going off of and being guided by, by the little bit of truth that they have, so they're okay. Jesus doesn't talk that way. God had established his leaders, the Levites, sons of Aaron, to guide the people. And then this crowd rose up and said, we can do it better. Nope. Should have shut that down real quick. Should have put a stop to that as soon as it reared up its ugly head. But granted, in times of persecution and great turmoil like that, it's hard to see that kind of stuff. But that's usually when bad things or bad people end up coming to power, is in times of unrest, is it not? Why is it that tyrants, dictators, end up being put into positions they have no right to be in?
Because people are apathetic.
People are apathetic, they're desperate. I mean, just think about Russia and all the bad leaders that they had. Stalin, Lenin. And you just sit back and you think about, like, how could anybody let a maniac like that come to, or Hitler for that matter? But you look at the state of those countries when they came in. Their economy was in the tanks. Deep poverty. People are starving. You had a ruling class that didn't know what they were doing, and they were abusing the people. And it's easy to get people whipped up into a frenzy. Think about Jerusalem. Think about the Jews at this time. Your country's not your own. You have another country in power over you. You're being abused, taxed. Can't you see how it'd be super easy? To have a group slip in, it's just, well, you put us in charge. you take our lead, we can help you get rid of some of this stuff. But what did the Pharisees end up doing? The Pharisees just ended up buddying up with the Romans. That's the prime time for something like this to happen. Same thing goes on inside of the church. Some kind of turmoil, some type of unrest ends up coming in. And then you have a section that slips into power inside of the church that shouldn't be there. And just ends up taking the entire thing off the rails. And so it's times like that where you have to be super alert as to what's going on and the decisions that are being made. And to not allow emotion to overrun logic. In those types of periods. Well, of course, that's easier said than done. Thought?
I kind of have thoughts, but it's kind of going a different direction. But before we let go of the blind man completely, since it's just been a few scriptures since him, I've always thought of, it's just such a great miracle. And then as we've been studying, we're realizing that this whole thing that's going on is just another example for Jesus to use the situation to teach the crowds around them. And the stakes were so high for the Pharisees. It wasn't about the blind man. It was about getting him back in the fold so that the people could stay within order.
Yep.
But at the same time, the blind man becomes a true hero in the sense of what you were saying, where people have to rise up and be, shall we say, the heroes of their congregation and stand up against things that are, instead of being the complacent, apathetic person. He had a choice to make, and it was so public, and he made the right choice,
Yeah.
but at the cost of so much. But it didn't matter because he made the right choice.
Yeah.
And those were just my comments. So.
And how quickly the transition ends up taking place. And so like this, but this also goes back to the sermons that Jordan did about, being a leader and just simply means having influence. One moment, you're a blind beggar. And then the next minute, you're in front of the Pharisees and your neighbors and the entire crowd. And you have the opportunity to be a leader. And just, it happens that quickly. And if we're not operating off of conviction and our own true conviction and not just what we've been told for years and years and years, if we are not working off of true conviction and faith like the blind man was, when that spur of the moment transition hits, you may not be ready to step up and take on what it is that you're now in a position to do. So yeah, I mean, we might look at that and just say, oh, this is just a fluke situation and everything like that. And we're like, okay, yeah, that may be the case. But then just to sit back and stop and think about, well, how many people are going to end up being influenced by what this nobody ends up doing in that moment? And so that goes back to us being careful how we think about situations and moments that we find ourselves in and start downplaying it. Oh, well, no, this isn't going to be that big of a thing, or this isn't going to make that big of a difference, so on and so forth. No, you don't know. I mean, here we are almost 2,000 years later, and we're still reading about this man. Little moments have big impacts. And that is just, yeah, any one of us could be this blind man. And that we're called upon to give account, to give an answer. 1 Peter 3:15. All right, don't fall back. Don't grow weak or fearful in that moment. Stand strong. So yeah, it's a really good point of application to be made there, and that it's that Jesus is not the only great character that we have presented for us in going out and spreading the message. And that's helpful, that's needful, because a lot of people use that as an excuse. Oh, well, I'll never be Jesus, so therefore I'm not going to be able to do half of what he did. Okay, true enough. But you could be the blind man. Little insignificant nobody. But he did a great thing. And it's still helping a lot of people. Still reading about this from the standpoint of application to help people grow. So yeah, really good thought there. I'm trying to think here. Where would be a good stopping point?
You made it halfway.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Okay, we'll stop with 9:10. Let's see. Okay. He says, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. So there again is this division line, this distinction. Those on the outside, not saved. But if you're going to enter in, salvation. Shall go in and out, find pasture. The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. Again, the clear contrast that Jesus is setting out for them. Here's what I am coming to do. And here's what this other class is coming to do. In which, yeah, common sense. What does a thief do? He steals. But he not only steals, if he finds himself in a position to where, let's say he goes into a home and possibly wasn't intending to do anybody any bodily harm, but you just happen to get out of bed and now here you are between him and what he wants. Your life doesn't matter to him. Here's what they're coming to do, but here's what the true shepherd, the good shepherd, is coming to do. Provide life for every one of his sheep. But there's the distinction. You have to be one of his sheep. Those are the only ones that are receiving this. Here are the ones that would hear his voice, hear the shepherd's voice, and follow him, obey him, and make it into the fold, into the flock. Here's what you receive if you follow Jesus. Salvation. Go in and out. Find pasture. But here's what you're going to find out. Here's what you're going to have if you follow these false shepherds, these hirelings. You're only going to find death. And here's where the Luke passage comes into play to just show us to what extreme, to what level the Pharisees are reaching so as to keep the status quo. To just keep what they have, not to lose any of their sheep. In Luke 11:52, Jesus says, Woe unto you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. So we have, once again, the gatekeepers of information. But he takes it to another level. Not only are you holding back information, are you holding back knowledge, you enter not in yourselves, and them that were entering in, ye hindered. So not only are they holding back information, but they're standing in the way of people that would believe and that would come in. Doing everything that they can so as to stop people from entering in through that door. And it's all because they have misunderstood the role that they have inside of leadership. Yes, elders, different ones inside the congregation, we're supposed to be watching out. We're supposed to be mindful, diligently viewing that, okay, there are wolves in sheep's clothing. And that we need to refrain, we need to withhold those from entering in. But others, those that are following after Christ, we need to make sure that we're not in a position to where we're actually holding them back from entering in. And simply because, well, we have an idea about something or a tradition about something or a doctrine about something that's not founded upon what God's doctrine is, and then we end up being right here. Well, you don't quite fit in with what we're trying to do here. That's not what we're supposed to be doing.
Not our kind of people.
Yeah. But that's the way a lot of brethren are. Because they have their little group, and they like their little group, and they're not wanting anybody new or anybody different to come in and start messing up what they have. It's us few, nobody new. You got the chosen, frozen, any other adage that you can throw along with it. Just, that's not the picture that we have here. Jesus is going to end up saying that there are other sheep that are not part of this Jewish flock, of this Jewish fold. And I'm trying to bring them in to what I'm building. All right, then you better get used to and get comfortable with some new people coming in that you may not be used to hanging around with. And of course, that has its connection with that Jew and Gentile relationship coming together. And we'll look at some of Paul's references to that, specifically in the Ephesian letter next week as we dig into that deeper. We will pick up in verse 11 in the mention of I am the good shepherd. And also we have in that mention of his death, crucifixion. So any other thoughts, questions of what we looked at, John 10 through 10? What you got?
I was going to say, are you sure there's no questions?
All right, going once, going twice. Don't try to ask a question, make a comment after we stop recording. Okay. Then we will take our break.